Welcome to the second roundtable of today. Apologies for a slight delay. I take full responsibility for taking the speakers on a walk around Luxembourg. But now we are back and happy to start again. And we now continue the discussions through the second roundtable organized around the question of infrastructures, looking into the relationships and translations of design norms, standards, and codes between earthly and non-earthly environments, as well as the role these translations play in perpetuating existing social inequalities. Again, it is a great pleasure to welcome Megan Eardley and Fred Scharmen, our second two speakers of today. After the lectures, we will open up discussion where we will have also Valentin Bansac join as a co-moderator. I will now briefly introduce all of the participants and then we can continue with the lectures. So Megan Eardley is an architectural historian, currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Excellence for Anthropocene History, KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. She studies the intersections of architecture, science and technology, and political philosophy in the 20th and 21st centuries. Her current research examines how the South African mining industry shaped models and concepts of life in deep space during the Cold War. In recent years, her work has been supported by NASA, the National Science Foundation, the History of Science Society, as well as the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Welcome, Megan, and thank you for joining us today. Fred Scharmen teaches architecture and urban design at Morgan State University, School of Architecture and Planning. He's the co-founder of the Working Group on Adaptive Systems, an art and design consultancy based in Baltimore, Maryland. His first book, Space Settlements, was published in 2019 by Columbia University Press, while his second book, titled Space Forces, Examining a Broader History of Human Aspirations in Space, was published in 2021 by Verso Books. Fred's writings appeared in Journal of Architecture Education, Atlantic City Lab, Slate, Log, Volume, Domus, to name just some. Fred was also one of the contributors to the project How to Mine the Moon, exhibited as part of the Luxembourg Pavilion in Venice last year. Thank you for coming. And Valentin Bansac is an architect, researcher, and photographer who currently teaches at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. In 2022, he co-founded Matters.xyz, a tentacular collective endeavor that explores new territorial narratives through creative research and exhibitions. Together with Alice Lumeau and Mike Fritsch, Valentin has been selected as the next curator of the Luxembourg Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale with the project titled Sonic Investigations. So many thanks to all for joining us today. We will start with the lecture by Megan and then continue with the lecture by Fred and then go on with the discussion as we did in the previous roundtable. So please go ahead, Megan.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the really fabulous dialogue that we're having. I'm just super excited to be here. Maybe just a quick note on my images before I start. I'm working with archival images that are often quite disturbing, so I've tried to limit the number of images that I'm showing, but we can talk through, what kind of images these are. So let me just start with the presentation. In 1968, just before the US landed the first man on the moon, NASA's Office of Space Medicine produced what it called a compendium of human responses to the aerospace environment. The aims of the compendium, published in November 1968, were threefold. The first was to review what they called all existing qualitative and quantitative human data available to engineers and life scientists then working to develop design criteria for manned spacecraft systems. The second aim of the compendium was to establish for what they called every critical environmental parameter a statement regarding A, the range of the body's normal function, B, the range above and below which the body's performance would be impaired, and C, the body's absolute tolerance limits. Finally, the third aim of the compendium was to develop a, quote, comprehensive reference on human factors and their design standards for all future manned space system requirements. To fulfill these aims,
we don't see the slides, so
here we go.
Now yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. To fulfill these aims, NASA contractors worked to compile and evaluate all studies published in English related to man's performance in thermal environments variously classified as cold, comfortable, tolerable, hot, and dangerous. The compendium was an ambitious work in progress, which would be updated and challenged as researchers continued to pursue a variety of analog environmental studies on Earth. And it is precisely in this movement between the known limits of the human body and possible future environments of inhabitation that NASA's engagement with South Africa's research on man's acclimatization to heat became critical to understand. After the Second World War, the South African mining industry drove research on an increasingly planetary scale, as companies developed extremely hot mines more than 2 miles below the Earth's surface. Industrial physiologists showed that mine workers classified over time through racial descriptors including Native, Bantu, African, and Black, could be made to work longer at higher heart rates at temperatures above 32 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Fahrenheit than they could at lower temperatures. They demonstrated that man's blood circulated faster in the heat. So increased circulation prevented the oxygen deprivation that would otherwise lead to muscle fatigue. During the Cold War space race, South African researchers shaped international debates about acclimatization and work in high heat. What might, so kind of starting to look at the adaptation of these South African studies into NASA's design standards, we might start to ask what sustained attention to these kind of design experiments can teach us about the reproduction and shifting concepts of race that are articulated in the exploration of environments that are too hot to sustain biological processes of growth and reproduction. In the interest of time, I'd like to think just through one scenario together with you. And this comes from the 1968 compendium itself. As you can see on the slide here, it concerns variations in rectal temperature at sea level as a function of activity, which worked to establish the thermal parameters within which man could work before his physiological response would be altered by environmental conditions. And here in the text, you can see South Africa's, quote, Bantu or African natives recruited for mine work. And they are making up the data points at the outer edges of kind of physiological robustness, or what the human body can withstand. Kind of South Africa's research is establishing the outer limits. Where NASA's contractors write in their evaluation that, quote, superficial differences between ethnic groups appear to be due to habitat patterns and experience relative to working under hot conditions. They actually inverted the conclusion of the researchers at South Africa's Human Sciences Laboratory that were publishing their studies as early as 1963. And these South African researchers asserted that there is a racial difference which would be exposed when men are confronted with extreme heat stress. The South Africans didn't quite know where to locate race, and this becomes kind of the ongoing concern and drive in the context of apartheid, where race is an organizing principle of social and political life. And so they struggled to identify a mechanism that would explain this difference, or it would explain where to locate race, in part because they struggled to define what race was. Sometimes they defined it as a series of anthropometric differences that could be studied through the classification of people's physical features. Sometimes they defined it as a genetic reality that would have to be studied on a genetic basis. And sometimes they described it as a cultural difference that would be best studied in building and habitation practices. So it's this kind of shifting definition and shifting capacity to locate what race is. But the tests that they developed in this context were concerned not only with what could be measured, but also what could be built. Between the 1950s and the 1980s, the South African Chamber of Mines sponsored a variety of experimental chambers and apparatuses which challenged the established boundaries of human physiology and the possibilities of human labor inside the world's deepest mines. As they worked deeper, miners exposed to virgin rock temperatures well over 55 degrees Celsius and 130 degrees Fahrenheit. By the 1950s, miners working in the hottest mines faced lethal forms of thermal stress. They became vulnerable to nausea, dizziness, and faintness, which could cause serious accidents and death, as well as the destruction of the industry's critical infrastructures. Virtually unimpeded by ethics committees or questions of consent, the Chamber of Mines sponsored research on the miners' response to extreme heat in order to determine the point at which ventilation and cooling interventions became a biological requirement, and also to establish the parameters in which such interventions would significantly improve miners' productivity. They began their experiments testing the limits of men recruited from what they called tropical Africa. By this, they meant mostly Mozambique. And they were already preferred to do the work in the deepest part of the mines. So they're working with miners that have a lot of exposure to ultra deep and ultra hot mines. And then they expanded to test all new recruits, and eventually men that were not employed by the mining houses at all. As they expanded their field of study, researchers at the Human Sciences Laboratory observed that skin and skin temperature would be fundamental parameters to understand how heat is exchanged between the miner's body and the underground environment. So their studies would concentrate on the radiative transfer of heat, which is a type of transfer that occurs without bodily exchange. And they would do this studying the movement of electromagnetic waves. In deep mines, where the difference between the rock face and the miner's internal temperature is extreme, this mechanism of heat exchange was thought to be the more powerful than man's capacity to sweat, and more common than his direct contact with the rock. The problem, as researchers explained, is that it's difficult to measure the surface temperature, even of an inert body. And when a thermometer is placed in contact with the skin, its existing physiological state would be altered. The thermometer's touch would have a negligible impact on most forms of medical monitoring. For experiments at the limits of survivability, however, it could become the difference between life and death. And so, as South African researchers began to demand a device that could determine the temperature of the skin's surface without touching it, or without conflating it with the man's internal core temperature, they began to remove skin from his body to study it more thoroughly. In the 1967 study entitled Measurement of the Normal Emissivity of Skin Without the Need for Measuring Skin Temperature, researchers outlined a two-pronged solution to eliminate the problem of touching skin. First, they argued that the skin's capacity to emit radiant heat effectively could be determined by its total emissivity when it was studied under infrared light. Then they said if they could determine skin's emissivity, they could use radiant flux to obtain skin temperature without applying a measuring device to the surface. The skin holder, which is what you see diagrammed here, is the device that would make this possible. The device itself would have three parts. The first was the radiometer itself. The radiation sector was composed of a commercially available thermal detector consisting of a single semiconductor thermocouple with one junction at the focus of a covering metallic mirror and the other attached to the back of the mirror. The thermocouple junction was inserted into a copper block. Following a change in the heating coil current, it would take about an hour for the radiometer to reach equilibrium. The target temperature would have to be kept constant for a period sufficiently long for a few step adjustments to be made in the temperature of the radiometer. Because it was unlikely that a skin site on a living body could be kept at such a constant temperature for more than a few minutes, they needed a different solution. Since a suitable radiometer, of which the temperature could be changed, say 6 times in a few minutes, was not yet available, the experiments would have to be confined to excised skin. These were placed on a holder, which was designed to support a 3.8 centimeter diameter circular skin sample that was placed in a horizontal plane, with the epidermal side exposed and the dermal side maintained in a controlled but variable temperature bath. This controlled temperature was provided by circulating a simple lactate ringer solution at a constant temperature in contact with the dermal side. The use of a liquid, say in distinction from something like a heating coil, would prevent local variations in temperature on the plane of the skin. The skin in its living state would be heated in a similar way by the blood. Finally, they made a reference black body. Black bodies would be the contemporary term for any idealized physical body that absorbs all incident radiomagnetic radiation, regardless of the frequency or angle of its exposure. Black bodies are commonly used in heat and physics experiments for this reason. They provide this kind of constant measure. The black body made for the skin holder was consisting of a conical cavity of 11 centimeters depth and 40 apex angle. Its aperture was reduced to 6 centimeters using a circular diaphragm, and the cavity was painted with a matte black paint, not dissimilar from the paint used here in experiments that covered the surface of miners that were inserted into these experimental chambers designed to measure heat exchange of the surface of the body. So in this apparatus, the black body is immersed in a well-stirred oil bath that would be controlled by a mercury contact thermostat. Each time radiation from the skin sample was measured, the same measurement was carried out on the black body. So you have this parallel that's set up between the skin sample, this small piece of skin that's cut from a cadaver and immersed in this water bath in this mechanism where it's going to be kind of hovered here, and the black body that's set up next to it in order to be able to make comparisons of how heat exchange is happening. And so there's these parallel measurements that are happening. Because touching or moving the radiometer disturbed the thermal equilibrium, a sliding rack was constructed, which served to position the skin sample and the black body alternately below the fixed radiometer. So they're not just putting them side by side, but they're alternating how they're measuring them. So you have this kind of capacity to kind of alternate between skin and black body. The aperture of the black body and the surface of the skin were then locked into the same horizontal plane. So the 1967 article reports that the laboratory tested some 30 samples of skin to calibrate their devices. And these were pulled from cadavers that were unnamed South African dead. Only 2 of these samples were named in the article. One was named as white breast skin, and the second was named as a sample of Bantu abdominal epidermis. As a trace of the racial constitution of life and labor in deep space, I find this detail of these 2 names pretty difficult to parse. Because at once it seems to suggest that they're studying the racial properties of skin, because they are identifying the samples by racial categories. But at the same time, because they're taking different aspects of these bodies, they're kind of denying the possibility of comparison on a racial basis. These things don't actually correspond to the same part. One sample was cut from a white man's breast, and the other is harder to locate. Maybe it's from a black man's stomach, maybe it's from his muscle, it's not really clear. So as I'm sitting here with this history, thinking about how it might shape questions about the pathological growth of the laboring body, as well as contemporary debates about its reproduction beyond the geochemical limits of the earth, I'm wondering if we can maybe start to learn from Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Hortense Spiller's foundational study in how race and gender are inscribed and animate in the flesh. Analyzing the transatlantic constitution of blackness, Spillers made a conceptual distinction between the captive body and the hieroglyphics of flesh that scholars continue to debate in legal and medical terms. For Alexander Wehelier, flesh is, quote, a temporal and conceptual antecedent to the body, end quote. The body, which may be taken to stand in for legal personhood via self-possession, is violently produced through, quote, high crimes against the flesh. On the other hand, flesh is before the body in that it is everywhere subject to and at the disposal of the body. As Rivana Bradley has argued, the body is cleaved from the flesh, while flesh is serially cleaved from the body. Sakea Ayman Jackson's pushes us further to consider what she calls the specter of black matter, the mother that is denied to blackened flesh, which she connects through subtle rhyme and spelling parallels to the scientific study of dark matter, that is, non-representability. Without calling for an explicit comparison between the racial constitution of blackened flesh and the scientific study of its hypothetical form of matter, which appears not to interact with light or the electromagnetic field, she argues that non-representability haunts the terms and operations that are tasked with adjudicating the thought world or the proper perception of the world as such. And as it does, it disturbs hierarchical distinctions not only between science and fiction, subject and object, but also speculation and realism, which turn on the attendant apenas related to eminence and transcendence. So in coming back to NASA's uptake of the South African studies, and the way that South African knowledge about the limits of the bodies went into NASA's imagination about the astronaut and also the limits of the physiological body in extraterrestrial environments. Maybe this is another way to say that we can't separate NASA's design standards from apartheid's infrastructure any more than we can separate the measurements of his flesh from the extractive industry on Earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. Fred, please go ahead.
Let's see. Thank you so much, Maria and Maribel, for the invitation. It's really interesting to hear all these conversations and to participate in these conversations and to hear these stories, many of which I haven't heard before as someone who his field is architecture, but I really like to say that what I study is the history and theory of architecture and urban design in space. And what I take for granted in that study is that there are no real hard and fast differences between the mainstream spatial practices that we usually think about and the way that space science thinks about spaces for the future. And indeed, as a third term, the way that science fiction also imagines those kinds of spaces and those kinds of bodies. So I'm very interested in these conversations and these stories, and I hope to hear even more that are new to me to participate on that dialogue. So good. So this talk is entitled Space Code, Spatial Practice on and Away from Earth. And I start with this quote because it captures something else that's easy for me to forget, which is that architecture and infrastructure mediate our relationship with pre-existing environments, and that when the environment in question is fundamentally hostile, there's no existence possible without that mediation. Adjust that a little bit. In space, as Elvia Wilkes says here, everything is architecture. There is no outside anymore, but everything is also infrastructure. The things that underlie and support us come to the foreground. On Earth, the built environment is, along with food and medicine, one of the most heavily regulated regimes in human life. And in this talk, I want to make a case that these modes of regulation are in effect a kind of soft infrastructure with real and hard consequences. The proliferation of standards, regulations, norms, and laws that define the dimensions and material properties of architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, civil engineering, and transportation are a true infrastructure. They are abstract and immaterial. They lie beneath and produce the sometimes literally concrete aspects of the world we move through every day. When we, as the designers and builders of the structures that shape our lives, have to reckon with these often tangled directives, they can often be mind-numbingly boring at best and desperately frustrating at worst. But the basis for their existence, I would say, is downright utopian. So in this talk, we'll have a little bit of the utopian, a little bit of the boring, and hopefully not too much of the frustrating. In the United States, the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, NCARB, sets the standards that need to be met for someone to claim the professional title of architect, which, along with other designations like doctor and lawyer, is legally protected and regulated. NCARB issues the model rules of conduct to describe the expectations to go along with that title. So this is sort of a code of behavior if you have that professional title. The foremost guiding principle for these model rules recognizes that the primary obligation that architects have is to the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Even though, as architects, offer professional services for fees to private clients and therefore act in their interest, in legal terms, the interests of the public should come first, and those interests should override the client's private wishes if they should come into conflict. And according to the strictest legal interpretation of this principle, if I, as an architect, a professional architect, observe any conditions that are detrimental to the health, safety, and welfare of the public, I'm obligated to report those conditions, even if those conditions have nothing to do with work that I personally executed. So it's almost like a role that defines your everyday existence in every scenario forever with legal consequences. A further layer of regulation, and these diagrams to follow are all from Francis Ching's really wonderful book, Building Codes Illustrated. A further layer of regulation, law, building code, helps ensure that the public's health, safety, and welfare is protected in the built environment. Fire codes, for example, exist to preserve human life first and prevent property loss second. Egress paths are designed like river tributaries, sized to accept the maximum amount of possible users that might be inside a structure at any given time and funnel them to safety. Egress paths are deliberately redundant. They are required to provide at least 2 ways out of heavily occupied spaces in case one is blocked by the emergency. Another guiding principle specifies that each space a person encounters on their way out should be more safe than the space they've just left. So egress corridors are constructed to resist fire damage longer than the rooms they service, and exit stair towers are made to last even longer than that. Material choices, construction methods, and active systems like sprinklers for fire suppression and ducts for smoke evacuation all function infrastructurally and together with the configuration of the architecture to provide safe routes to the exterior. So even something seemingly simple like finding a door handle where you expect to in the dark and smoke can make the difference between life and death. So building codes tend to normalize around certain key dimensions and properties. Whether the jurisdiction is in the European Union, the United Kingdom, or the United States, code will place door handle hardware, somewhere in a relatively narrow range of only about 40 centimeters. And the zones where standards overlap will always be the safest place to locate and to search for the handle. Other standards and guidelines are based on the dimensions of a hypothetically average human being. And this, as Megan's talk reminds us, is always a fraught undertaking when we are looking to address the widest possible range of body types and abilities. So in space, these aspects of dimension and ability as human factors are the primary drivers of the kinds of standards and guidelines that NASA uses to regulate the design of habitats and vehicles. And the descendants of the kind of databases that Megan references are drawn from military data. So today, NASA, in order to set the guidelines for a given piece of hardware, will first look at data that the military has collected, and they will normalize, they'll statistically normalize those dimensions and pick a range for, how tall we should design a space or a suit or a vehicle for, how large, how much mass that person would have. So but they don't examine that choice of where the data comes from. And as we've seen, the roots of that data are very complicated and very fraught. But even still, that source is unexamined, remains unexamined today. So in space, as Elvia Wilk says, everything is architecture. But to organizations like NASA, architecture is always inherently a practice in the domain of system design. So instead of building code, what serves in its place here is known as human systems integration. But instead of converging, as in the case above with the door handle, these guidelines and standards tend to proliferate and diverge. Just among the space stations that currently exist in orbit or on the drawing boards that might serve future NASA undertakings, many standards exist. One set of human systems integration guidelines defines the design and construction of the International Space Station. Another set of guidelines is adhered to by the designers of the Chinese Tiangong station, also currently in orbit with a crew of 3. The planned Gateway station, with modules under construction right now, and due to be in orbit around the moon as part of the Artemis program in just a few years, has still other guidelines that define it. The components here, the modules, the capsules, the cylinders, are around 2/3 of the diameter of the modules in ISS, so standards for sleeping space, for example, had to be revisited and compromised. And as recently as 2023, NASA was soliciting industry partners and academics for input on new guidelines that would help define the safety and usability of the 3 proposed next-generation space stations that would be built and operated by private companies in a program known as CLD, for commercial low Earth orbit destinations. This is the next-generation station designed by Axiom. This is Starlab, designed by Voyager Space with other partners. And this is Blue Origin's Orbital Reef Station, designed to act as, according to materials released by Blue, an office park in space. And so this is NASA applying the same kind of model to private industry now for space stations that they applied previously to the development of human crew-capable launch vehicles. So in the same way they sort of subsidized Blue Origin and SpaceX to develop new vehicles, now they're subsidizing the study and design of a new generation of space stations. And this is really going to happen. These things are under construction, as I indicate, and they're on schedules to launch and be activated. The ISS will only really last until 2030, mostly due to issues regarding metal fatigue and microfractures. They have to keep reboosting it. That can only happen so many times before it literally starts to fall apart. Where emergency is concerned, the International Space Station and other installations use a nautical model instead of an architectural one. There are no stair towers here, but there are lifeboats. At any given time, there should be enough seats available in spacecraft that can return to Earth, as there are humans aboard the station. In actual nautical architecture on Earth, though, the number of lifeboat seats is almost always twice the number of passengers and crew. But this redundant safety factor is left behind in space, at least for now. So to give you an example of the seriousness with which they take this, there were 2 crew members who are still trapped in space, Sonny and Butch, if you know their names, 2 astronauts, who were brought up in a Boeing capsule that then the engineers lost faith in. They lost faith in the reliability of the maneuvering system, so they decided to deorbit the capsule without taking the astronauts with them. There was a brief period of about a couple of months where there was no way out for them, no seats. In the next SpaceX launch, they improvised 2 emergency seats in case they had to evacuate, even during that small interval. So they had seats for Butch and Sonny during that time. So now there's a new ride, and they're going to be safe and come home in a SpaceX vehicle. Again, unlike the converging standards that put a door handle in a place we'd expect to find it during an emergency, the form and function of these spacecraft has started to become very different. If a crew member makes it to the nearest lifeboat, there's no guarantee that they would be trained on the equipment's interfaces and affordances. So here's the instrument panel, for example, of that Boeing Starliner command module, which is, again, still in more or less experimental phases. It's not fully crew-rated, as the terminology goes. Here are the instruments in the current generation of Russian Soyuz spacecraft, which have been flying in some form or another since 1967. The Soyuz interior, incidentally, was designed by an architect named Galina Balashova, the first true space architect. The human factors engineers, as you can see, have had their way with it since then. One of the innovations that they've made on the positive side is to add these little protectors on the toggle switches so that you can't accidentally, hit the buttons that do the emergency eject or whatever. So here, by contrast, is the instrumentation designed by SpaceX, and which, fairly safe to say, are heavily influenced by, feels like automotive design, and also heavily reliant on touchscreens and the special gloves that work only with them. And I have to acknowledge my sometime collaborator, Justin Walsh, for pointing this out. If I get into a car here in Luxembourg, I can be relatively confident of finding the steering wheel where I'd expect and the gas and brake pedals to be in the configuration that I'm used to. It's not so with these spacecraft. So even beyond the issues raised by these, oh, sorry, I should still be on this one. So even beyond these issues raised by control affordances, the different seats, the actual physical architecture of the vehicles are designed to fundamentally connect to each company's specially designed custom suits as well. There are special suits for extravehicular activity, but there are also what they call flight suits, which are protected against vacuum in case there's like an emergency depressurization of the capsule on the way up or down, which actually happened to Soyuz 1. So in an emergency, you might find yourself able to access an escape vehicle, but you might not be able to sit in it. In space, everything is infrastructure, and when that infrastructure isn't regulated, the health, safety, and welfare of the spacefaring public is at risk. There are some success stories, though. The androgynous peripheral attach system, shown here, for docking spacecraft, was first developed jointly by engineers from the American and Soviet space programs in the 1970s in order to facilitate the Apollo-Soyuz test project. This was a mission in which Russian and American crews linked up for the first time in space. And this event marked the end of the space race to land on the moon. That's also sort of the beginning of the end of the Cold War. This docking protocol and hardware is the ancestor of the interface that allows Russian and American modules on the International Space Station to connect today. And since China's space hardware is modeled on the old Soviet designs, they use the same protocol too. The United States and China do not currently cooperate in space, but thanks to the codes that define this infrastructure, they could. So what I want to say is that this is a kind of infrastructural utopianism, where concrete hardware standards meet abstract aspirations. And it's present, I think, in artifacts like this. This is the foundations of building code, but also the foundations of cooperation in space. And appropriately, this spirit is captured in the official Soviet patch for the Apollo-Soyuz project, also designed by space architect Galina Balashova. And so these are the relationships that we generally understand ideals and codes to have. The codes bring about the material manifestation of our utopian ideals by way of translations, first into guaranteed rights, and then into law. So the aspiration to protect the, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as the American Declaration of Independence has it, becomes in a document like the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution, a set of explicit but non-exhaustive enumerated rights. The law then gives the government the capacity to regulate and protect those rights, as it does here in this piece of legislation from the 1970s that established federal oversight over fire prevention code. And then standards are developed and enshrined, like the ones we've seen here that regulate the height of things like door handles. But in practice, things are not always so clear. Histories of building code often start almost 4,000 years ago with the Code of Hammurabi, which includes a few lines about home construction. And forgive me, I realize these slides are hard to read, but this says, if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls in and kills its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. And that's Hammurabi, circa 1750 BC. So in practice, it seems humans have had something like building code long before we've had basic rights, or at least before those rights were enumerated and written down. Only later, we might say, did these street-level modalities percolate upwards into lofty abstractions. In the United States, civil rights advocates like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth successfully operated on this apparatus from attack points in the middle. In his famous 4th of July speech from 1852, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, as it's commonly known, Douglass used the gap between ideal and reality as a successful rhetorical device. And I'll read this too. He says, quote, "Would you have me argue that a man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it." So, here he's able to take the stated ideals at their word, that, quote, all men are created equal. He's able to point out the obvious failure to follow through on those utopian ideals. He's taking them as given and turning them back against the state itself. So this work and others like it, Surgeon Truth famously also expanded the abstract category of man in her speech, Ain't I a Woman, as it's colloquially known. So in these kinds of operations, these workings were eventually successful at getting the American Constitution itself revised, with the 13th Amendment explicitly outlawing slavery. Ideals were more carefully defined, laws and codes eventually followed suit, codifying integration in the built environment. So this operation proceeds from sort of the middle outward, both towards abstract ideals and towards sort of street-level legislative practices. And in the space domain today, we can find that the two ends of this mechanism are sites of active work. At the top, we have ideals, especially as stated in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which we already heard about a little bit this morning, which is as a utopian document that you'll ever likely to find in the realm of international law. It specifies, for one thing, that no state can claim sovereign territory in places away from Earth. But in Article 5, I'd say the treaty goes even further, specifying that anyone carrying on activities in outer space has certain rights and responsibilities when it comes to others doing the same. Especially important here is the principle of mutual aid. So the text of Article 5 itself, I'll read it at the top, says, in carrying on activities in outer space and on celestial bodies, the astronauts of one state party shall render all possible assistance to the astronauts of other state parties. And this is, I think it's key that all possible assistance is defined in the most broad possible terms, right? We can imagine a situation where you might need air and I have the ability to provide air. I have the responsibility to do that, or I could get hauled before the Hague in violation of the treaty, right? So it has consequences in the hardware, right? My delivery system has to plug into your ability to receive air, right? So that has implications in code, but also has implications, I think, in terms of social and political life in space, right? What if I am deficient in calories for the day, right? And you have the ability to provide calories. You have the obligation to share, right? What if someone is in a situation with regard to lack of housing or in some kind of abuse situation, right? We all, as people carrying on activities in space, are obligated to provide aid in those situations. And I'm not a space lawyer. I've had several conversations with very generous space lawyers who are sometimes still my friends. If there's anyone else in space law out here, I'd love to have a talk with you about this. But I think that one of the sticking points here is the definition of an astronaut, right? As private actors have moved into space, we've heard all kinds of qualifiers added to that term, private astronaut, commercial astronaut. I would argue, and I think an interpretation, again, in the broadest possible terms of the Outer Space Treaty, would indicate that anybody carrying on activities in space is an astronaut and therefore subject to these rights and responsibilities enumerated by the document. So, at the bottom, again, we have standards and guidelines. So NASA also, in documents like the CLD, the Commercial LEO Destination Requirements and Standards of 2023, does set the dimensions, certain key dimensions, sometimes derived from anthropometrics, sometimes derived from hardware standards that should define the design of the environment. We have the street level codes, and we have the top level ideals. But I think what's necessary here and what's vital going forward is to move both of these statements from the outward back to the middle and to define basic rights and to define simple, more clear and more direct international law that follows through on the obligations that the Outer Space Treaty sets for us all. So that process would move from the edges towards the middle, filling in the missing pieces on the scheme. So in space, everything is architecture, everything is infrastructure, everything should support mutual aid and benefit the health, safety, and welfare of the spacefaring public. And I even argue that there's a consonance here between the obligations of the figure of the astronaut, which are essentially to the health, safety, and welfare of every other member of the spacefaring public, and the obligations to the professionally defined figure of the architect, who in their daily life should embody that same sort of, what we call in my profession, standard of care. And here I'd like to end by invoking that same idea complex from another direction via science fiction author Ursula K. Le Guin's broad definition of technology as anything that helps compose the human relationships with the world, and I think by extension, the human relationships with one another. Ursula Le Guin has a great document, you can find it online, called A Rant About Technology, in which she talks about how the expectations for science fiction authors often revolve around a very narrow definition of technology that covers things like the spaceship, the fighter jet, the robot. And she wants to advocate on behalf of a broader definition of technology that includes things like textiles, cookware, stories, political documents like the Outer Space Treaty, and norms and practices like building code, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I think I always need more paper, actually. Like, I take so many notes, like, after each lecture. But I think it was really brilliant to hear your takes on this topic. And also, somehow, I think the two lectures really kind of communicated with each other quite in a very interesting way. It reminds me, also this conversation brings me also to one book that you might also be aware of by Nicolas de Monchaux, right? Space Suits, where he also writes somehow, he takes in a way space suit also as a form of architecture. I think this is where, Fred, when you say in space everything is architecture and everyone is an astronaut, I think this kind of brings a completely different take on how we look also into spatial relationship. But there is one quote from this book, which I think is very interesting. And it says, space has been defined crucially as the environment we need technology to enter. And I think this somehow the very powerful role of technology and what starts to count as technology and how technology starts to shape bodies, right? And the other way around becomes very important. And what Megan was saying, I think, in a way, this opens up a question for me. Maybe this is a question for both of you, and maybe you would like to reflect on that. When we talk about the minor, we talk about one set of norms, and we talk about one way of originating those norms, kind of building on the history of the body of the minor, also as a kind of marginalized, often racialized figure as well. When we talk about the explorer or the astronaut, we might talk about another kind of normativity. So I'm kind of wondering, as we are now, as we were walking, I think it was Anna Maria who said 2026 is very close and the topic is becoming urgent, right? And Elon Musk is somehow already with one foot already in the government, and we will be talking about these questions probably in a very different tone, in a very different way, also very soon. I am wondering if we think in terms of speculative, let's say, imaginaries, and when we think about different kinds of typologies of architecture in space, so beyond the space station or beyond the space suits, how do you see also that this, let's say, this social, political aspect of norm will change? Will we also see, I'm kind of thinking about Bethany's golf resort on the Mars, I think, no? Like, if I'm remembering correctly. But I'm kind of thinking practically, how do these different roles, different subjectivities, and their own origins, political origins of the norms they embody, how do you see this in terms of, let's say, speculative kind of, like thinking of architecture, infrastructure in the next coming years when we talk about space? So I don't know if it's like clear enough, but maybe just to hear your take on this. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's a brilliant question, and I'm excited to hear what Fred has to say as well. I think that what's critical in the South African mining context is that the industry was doing its best to drive down costs, right? So the appeal of doing these studies on the limits of human physiology was to cut down the cost of infrastructure, right? So the goal is to reduce the amount of cooling and the amount of getting hot air up, right? So the more that you can rely on the human body as a kind of technology, right, in order to be self-sufficient, the better, right? So the tests are about exposure, and I think that in thinking about the kind of imagination around the miner versus the astronaut, they have a very kind of similar relationship to extreme environment. And I think, in the kind of constant back and forth with the analog environment, right? And this investment in the idea that like there's these parallel spaces on Earth and we can kind of have this constant doubling, right? And we can learn and we can apply what we learn on the analog, to the unknown, and we can have these kind of double Earths, right? I think that what it becomes the exception in that is the way the body is understood, because in space the body is absolutely encrusted and encased, right? So a lot of the
and cared for.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of these the questions about design standards that facilitate a legal requirement of care, is and I don't want to pretend like there aren't standards of care in mining communities, but they're not something that is guaranteed by the industry. Right. Rather, you have a lot of informal practices that miners develop to take care of each other, but that's not at all encouraged or institutionalized. I think there's also a really important distinction in what we're talking about in terms of like what is the authority that is setting standards? Because and this becomes super important in the contemporary space race, and this contemporary commercial astronaut. I think it's a really different history looking at the history of industrial standards. I mean, there is a really close relationship between the apartheid state and the mining companies, but it is the mining companies that are driving the research, not the state. And so the interests of capital, in terms of like, cost comparison and these kind of things, like those are what are driving what the industry can do, and the kind of questions of maybe to go back to your question of like what kind of body they want, right? Because I think that
for what also
right, exactly, exactly. And I think that in the case of the astronaut, it's very much a kind of idealized understanding of the human, coming out of very particular philosophical traditions. And in South Africa, there's just an interest in like, how much can we push the body, can we deform it and still have it do labor, which is ultimately the function of the miner underground for the industry.
Yeah, you hit on so much there that I think is so essential. But to add to that, I'm fascinated by the figure of the mine as the inverse of the figure of something like the stair tower. It goes down, not up. It's not about this guarantee of safety. It's about this sort of ultimate set of risks. And I don't know quite what to do with that, but I think that's really interesting. Lucy Lepard says for every pile or every building, there's a hole somewhere, right? So I think there's that same kind of inversality or dialectic. And also, there's the I think what needs to be done is to put an end to these states of exception. Basically, is to recognize the trick and say we're not going to fall for the trick again, because these states of exception have been applied so many times over and over. Well, of course your job is dangerous. You're a miner. Well, of course your job is dangerous. You're an astronaut. In the early part of the 20th century, it was of course your job is dangerous. You work at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, right? So, building code was not seen to obtain in these domains. It's a trick, and it's one that is just going to keep being pulled over and over again, and we need to call it out before it's applied again, especially since there's a document like the Outer Space Treaty that we can use to hold the feet of industry to the fire. There is no inner space treaty for miners, which would be a great thing to have, some kind of document that enshrines basic rights in dangerous environments that our technology is dependent on, that are building a new frontier. So I think the key is to get out in front of that attempt to set a new state of exception. And the mechanism is there, as we see in the example that Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and others have shown us. The key, I think, is to instrumentalize and even weaponize ideals, which I'm excited about the possibilities for.
Okay, thank you. Valentin, do you want to proceed?
Yeah. Well, thank you both for the conversation. It was great to have the parallels also with the conversation from this morning. I think there were a lot of things that kind of touch on what we talked about. I was really interested in the way how you unravel how something like coding, like a kind of silent infrastructures, has so many consequences. And I believe what's interesting is that in some ways they can be beneficial, but also in many cases it's a tool for alienation and maybe structural racism also. And I couldn't help thinking also about like you talk about the mining codes, but also it made me think of comfort and like air conditioning that was designed on a specific body, which is maybe the body of the white man in this case. So it's also how these very hidden structures appear, no, and have an agency. But I have a question that's maybe more banal, or like I kept thinking you mentioned in your in the studies that were run with this extreme heat. I kept thinking of this thing we talked about this morning, the extremophiles, these organisms that survive in very difficult environments, and in some way we might also become extremophiles in the future. We might not have to go to space to that. So I was wondering if maybe these studies who had this kind of almost very negative impact on the workers could maybe, or maybe you found out that they could be used today to think about potential futures for Earth, where climate will become hotter. And I was wondering if maybe such studies resurface to imagine what are the possibilities on Earth, and not maybe in extreme conditions like in space or in mines. So that was my question so far.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, historically, the ultra deep mines were a source for new research in extremophiles. So a lot of the kind of scientific knowledge of what these organisms are and how they can be studied earlier we were learning about kind of where they are in the laboratories, but they're very much extracted from mined sites. So there's a historical continuity in terms of extremophile research. I think that the reason I'm really drawn to Jackson's research on what she calls like blackened skin, blackened flesh, and this process of racialization as something that is ongoing, right? Is because it's something that like creates space to talk about humanity and this desire for it to be something that has plasticity without it becoming something that is a free-for-all for all types of experimentation, right? And I think that, kind of the way that she looks at the history of medical experimentation on enslaved Black Africans, kind of where the understanding is that kind of their conditional or their relationship to humanity is one of convenience. So when it is convenient for this to be the model body, then they are fully human, and you can test them so that you don't test the white astronaut. But then when there's like a question of legal rights, or there's something about their body, that they could assert their membership in this humanity, then it can be pulled away, right? So it's this really pliable category. So I think that in making this distinction, between genealogies of the body and genealogies of the flesh, and like what the flesh is able to do in terms of becoming new, becoming different, right? To kind of estrange that and make that kind of the space of kind of humanity as a project, or as a ideal. I'm not exactly sure what word I'm looking for, but basically something that is kind of changing so that the form can change, and it doesn't have this rigid codes that can be weaponized against, right, people that are deemed to be inferior, or pushed into these positions. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but basically I think that there are already histories of thinking about humans as extremophiles, or wanting certain people to be extremophiles, right? As wanting to be the people that can pave the way for a more comfortable body, a more comfortable environment. So yeah, approaching that as like a kind of already there's already problems that we know to look out for because there's a history there.
Yeah, I like the way you kind of call for other ways to set norms that don't have to be hard-coded into, into the thermostat or something like that. Another thing that what we're talking about makes me think of, I'm glad you mentioned the idea of designing the air and the question of who the air itself is designed for. This is the thermostat question inherently. In the United States, the standard that you reference is ASHRAE Standard 55, which for years has governed. This is the code for the design of air, at least in North America. And nobody had looked at the roots of this code, just like nobody had looked at the roots of the figures that define extreme environments in space and human tolerance. It turns out that they had been codified in the 1950s, and they had indeed been built around the assumption of a 55-year-old white male in a full wool business suit. So it's like the air is designed for madmen, and so it's no wonder that that as contemporary offices exist, and we have to we all share space with others. The women all say, "I'm really cold," because the different metabolism rate was assumed, right? A different body was assumed as the figure, as the subject of the air. So, so what we need to do is go and have that negotiation and figure out what to set the thermostat to, which is a very different question than the question I think of extremophiles. The thermostat is a question of the comfort zone, is what heating and cooling engineers would call it. Finding that comfort zone is to some degree physiological, to some degree a set of negotiations with your neighbors and office mates. That's very different than the engineering concept of, what engineers, one name that for the practice that you examine here is like a test to failure, which is a very engineering-centric, very human factor-centric way to figure things out. We're just going to pressurize this vessel until it pops, and then we write down the last number, and then we increase the safety factor by 2, and then that's your pressure vessel, right? You either don't do that. Nowadays, you do that on a computer or something, right? You don't do that in real life. You don't subject real people to test to failures. Ideally, you want to have real people existing in a comfort zone where they can negotiate with their neighbors. So I think that no matter what happens with regards to climate crisis, what I hope for, again, I'm kind of a utopian idealist, as you might realize, but what I hope for a utopian idealist mode, is that there is something like a negotiation around the thermostat, that deciding to live with others on a planet might involve some kind of, whether it's geoengineering or whether it's carbon sequestration, that would be something like a thermostat for the planet's atmosphere. We would be designing the air. And I hope that would be a collective process where we're negotiating with others who are maybe unlike ourselves and figuring it out together rather than a test to failure.
Yeah, although what is, I guess, a difficult question in this is that the negotiation maybe has been done already, as like the standard is already being exported worldwide, and most of the world lives on 22 degrees or 55, I guess. But
you mentioned another thing to throw in here is optimization. The mines are optimized for profit generation. And if the planet is optimized for profit generation, then it's not going to be a place that has a comfort zone.
And it's just a comment, but I was really fascinated how somehow the regulation process was much more efficient in the, let's say, capital-driven mine than in space, where actually you showed how much there are these kind of discrepancies, within rules, and this is somehow fascinating to me. And I was wondering if maybe today with the new race for space that's happening, if there is a surge actually in codes and standards, or is that something we observe nowadays, or is still a kind of I wrote accumulate collaboration as accumulation.
Yeah, I think that is what we're seeing today, in the idea that every new space station needs a new set of guidelines to define, how it's put together and how its internal environment is regulated. I hope that metacodes, say, if you like, or meta categories or meta ontologies, like, it has an unfortunate origin, but that notion of man that's in foundational documents all over the world, that meta category was expanded by people like Sojourner Truth to include, they're just talking about all of humanity, which is really a good thing. That's a neat trick. So I hope that there can be a meta category for astronaut, say. This is what I hope that the trick that we can pull, that would then trickle down, that would then flow downstream to set basic rights, laws, and then codes, and then everybody else would have to catch up. Because that did happen in the United States. Again, in the history of building code, there were different regional codes that basically grew out of insurance agencies who were tired of paying out for disasters that were related to building failures. So there was one in the South, there was one in the West, and there was one in the Northeast in the United States, basically. But now we have the IBC, the International Building Code, which then is the overarching meta code, and then different regions now set their own little variations, but they all take certain things for granted. So which I think, which again is boring, but I think is the same kind of trick as these idealist kind of meta categories give us the opportunity to take advantage of.
I think this topic around insurance is also very interesting. No, like that's a kind of another chapter we will probably be discussing also at one point. But I will now use the opportunity to hand over the microphone to the audience. If there are any questions or notes or comments or thoughts, doubts, anything is possible. So please go ahead. Ready? Yeah.
Sorry, very loquacious. Actually, just wanted to kind of come back on the point that you just ended on, and about that category of man. And I was like struck, Megan, in your talk that you kind of continued to employ it, in the way that it's reflected in the documents. And I was kind of wondering about the ethic of using the term in that context for you, and like the choice to use the term man in your presentation.
Just making sure I understand the question. So in terms of referring to the limits of the physiological limits of man, for example?
Right.
Yeah.
So, like using, like, in some sense, you were quoting the documents at some points, and other points you were employing the category of man.
Yeah.
In a broader context that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Like, I guess, the socio-scientific humanities norm is to not use that term because of all the gendering, racialization, like the family of man, the conquest of space by man.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, it seemed like you were making a real active choice to use it.
Yeah, thank you. I think with this material, they're all really tricky choices, to be honest, because of the kind of violence in the archives. So there's a few different there's a few different things at play, right? There's the slipperiness around the language of race, both within the South African industry and in NASA, right? So they're both, these are kind of mid-20th, late 20th century documents, snapshots, right, of thinking of people in positions of power. And they reflect racial thinking as it's changing. And so when you're reading a series of documents, and even if you're reading a series of experiments by the same group of researchers, the language that they're using around these things is not very fixed. Some of that reflects the fact that they're doing experimentation, but some of it also reflects the sense that what they're trying to study, they can't place it easily, right? So it's this relationship between kind of the material and the imaginary, or kind of the speculative, and these kind of things, that the ideal, right, and the material they're not one-to-one, any of them. I think that I feel most confident in talking about kind of an ideological position that is shared between kind of the captains of industry in the South African context and NASA's engineers. I think there's a shared understanding of what that refers to. It is a very gendered and racialized subject position that has its origins in a kind of liberal, enlightened construction of the world. That's not necessarily the subject position that is shared by the men that are being experimented on in the South African context. There's a whole other issue, because the racialization of language there is that man would not be a category extended to these men, right? And this is, also shared in the American context, where you would be, kind of perpetually held as a child. So you would be referred to as a mind boy, right? So there's also this issue around, the exclusiveness of this category. But I think that that at least in what I'm trying to understand about kind of race in this history of extraction, as it's moving from kind of deep space on Earth to deep space in an extraplanetary sense, I think it is worth kind of staying close to the language to try to understand that, like, kind of changing ideologies. So I'm trying to stay very close to the language of the documents. But for sure, there's a lot of ethical questions around how to do that without kind of perpetuating the violence of that way of thinking. So they're difficult, and I'm very open to reflections and ideas of how to do it better, because I think it's not something I have fully resolved. But I think I'm more confident in saying, like, this is a shared project. Yeah. Right. Thanks.
I would really like to speak to that question that Rory has brought up, actually. Hi, you've done a fantastic job, both of you, and each panel is just kind of raising the bar higher for Rory and myself. So let's say I say this with both admiration and a level of worry, but let's stay on the former. I really want to hit on the issue of man, quite literally, because the thing is, in space physiology, women were not a subject for a very long time, and when they were, they tended to be excluded as an exception. And this is something we can speak to at length, but understanding the question of, let's say, inclusivity in discourse and also in sentiment with regards to the fact that these are people in space, in labs, and in different locations, let's say extremophilic or otherwise. It really is a question of human subject research that has prioritized an ideal, which also then goes towards the code, because the medical code here, as part of, let's say, the soft infrastructure, sorry to poorly borrow your own words, but here is where medicine actually kind of moves very horizontally between all three: the question of habitation, the question, of course, of physical safety, and the question, of course, of endurance. So sort of being able to carry out labor and duress. I feel like I'm going really heavy into monologue, and I'm going to just steer that very clearly out because I'm thinking about your talk in relationship to what's going to happen in very shortly. But I wanted to have your opinion, both of you, because I like this idea of the meta category, so to speak, but sometimes I feel we forget the tools at hand, and I'm with you there. I have blind spots in that regard legally because I'm not a lawyer, but I will mention two that I think are relevant to each of you. One is the ILO, basically, and codes of labor that have been very heavily borrowed on conditions of mining, because just by virtue of being in the global north and written and such, that's the industry that I think really sets the bar, and in fact has given us things like, the weekend in terms of seeing it as the factory processing some of this geological material, but what have you. So have you considered the ILO and its literature in different formats, both in terms of sort of hard law and soft law? And in your case, understanding that temporarily this is really moving far ahead, but borrows from earlier generations of human subject research, I'm thinking about the Helsinki Protocol and the different moments, if you will, where, because that one I think has 6 versions, having borrowed initially from Nuremberg and that having be the base. I think that really is an extreme scenario to borrow your language, not in the question of extremophilia, but the question of where has the law put to the test the hardest? And I think this is where I would approach the law in the circumstances that you're describing for astronauts, which, yes, the qualifier private and commercial should be something, frankly, that we just stop. Absolutely. I think anybody who works in space, actually, even on Earth, in some circumstances, if they're a test subject as such. But anyways, I've gone too long.
I think if I were in danger in space, I would want Jeff Bezos up there, able to provide aid. Even if they call him a space tourist, like, hey, the more billionaires up there, the better. If they're obligated to provide mutual aid, then that's great. as far as labor history goes, I admit that I don't know as much as I should beyond, reading Howard Zinn as a teenager. But what I think with that sort of surface level understanding, what I would say is that labor has historically operated in that same way, like attacking weak points in the middle, in that theoretical sort of devolution, in a good way, from ideals to street level practices. Labor has done a really good job of saying, like, what about this? This should not be a state of exception. So that's what I see, in my superficial level of reading labor history, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that maybe in my answer, I'd also point out the role of labor, organized labor in the South African context, because I think the story that I'm telling for this presentation is very, very focused on what the scientists are trying to do. And I think it's worth mentioning that even for their time, so this is kind of 50s to 70s, the bulk of the research they're doing, this is controversial. The level of kind of disregard for ethics of research was something that was challenged by other physiologists at the time. At the same time, these are the world's leading physiologists on thermal physiology. So they are, their research is used everywhere, but they do have people that don't want to collaborate, because the critique that gets registered in their journals is that they're setting standards. Basically, they're forcing miners to work beyond kind of what should be acceptable. And so the thermal stress that the miners are being subject to is not strictly a product of the environment, it's a product of the labor regime. And so the physiologists, in the community, it's controversial what they're doing. That being said, I just wanted to gesture quickly to the fact that this history of mining in apartheid South Africa is also a massive history of resistance and refusal. And so the kind of organization and collective organization of labor, arguably was one of the major forces of overthrowing apartheid, is when you had massive mining unions being consolidated. And exactly as Fred said, pushing to implement global standards of labor was a big part of kind of challenging the economic viability of the system. Thanks.
Thank you. Anna Marie, would you like to respond? No? Okay, great. I think I will return to my time management machine called cell phone to check whether, yes, we are on time. And if there is any other, maybe short question, we can take it. Otherwise, no? Or, okay, then I think we can wrap up here. Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Valentin, for a really great discussion, also to the questions from the audience. We will make a short break of 30 minutes and then continue with the last roundtable of today, which is centered around the question of commons with Rory Rowan and Ana Maria Gomez-Lopez. So please stay around. You can grab coffee or tea or some refreshment, and then we continue very soon. Thanks again for fantastic talks.